PO2 means partial pressure of oxygen and PCO2 means partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The oxygen from the alveoli diffuses into the blood, that is, it moves into the pulmonary vein. Sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against partial oxygen. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to the last session of this chapter, that is breathing and exchange of gases. I am Dr. Divya, Biology faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So in the previous session of this chapter, we had discussed about the mechanism of breathing, and we also understood how the different respiratory capacities are measured. There are various volumes or units that are used to measure them. So we also learnt about that. In today's session, we shall discuss about the exchange of gases, the transport of gases within a system, and also we shall learn about the various respiratory disorders. So to begin with, first we shall start with understanding about the exchange of gases. So here, alveoli. So alveoli is something that is present in the lungs, right? If you remember in the previous session, or if you don't know what alveoli is, you can go back to the previous sessions and have a look at it, wherein we studied the structure of the respiratory system, especially the lungs, right? So there I had told you the trachea that is there, it will branch. At the end, it will branch to form the primary and the secondary branches. These primary and the secondary branches, they end up, or the secondary branches end up in small bulb-like structures which are called as the alveoli. And it is in the alveoli actually the exchange of gases takes place. That is, the oxygen moves to the different tissues of the body or cells of the body, and the carbon dioxide is brought back into the alveoli, and that is from the alveoli it will enter into the trachea, it will reach the nasal region, and then it will come out of a nose. So that is how the respiration occurs. So here talking about the alveoli. So therefore, alveoli, they are the primary sites of exchange of gases. So here, exchange of gases can also occur between the blood and the tissues, right? You cannot say that oxygen when you take in can travel as such. Carbon dioxide leaving out of the body can travel as such. If it has to reach the alveoli, then there has to be a medium. There has to be something that actually carries them. So what is a transporter here? It is nothing but the blood. So what the blood does, it will collect the oxygen, gives it to the tissues, it will deliver the oxygen to the tissues, and in the tissues whatever carbon dioxide is there, that will be collected and it will be given back to the alveoli. So therefore, exchange of gases also occurs between the blood and the tissues. The first site where the gases reach is, it is the alveoli. Then afterwards, that is the blood and the tissues that actually participate in the exchange of the gases. So oxygen and carbon dioxide. So far I had been telling exchange of gases. What are the gases? Those gases are nothing but oxygen and carbon dioxide. So how are they exchanged? They are exchanged by a simple diffusion method. So what is diffusion? The movement of molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, right? So here talking about the alveoli. Talking about the body tissues. In the alveoli, oxygen is more because we have breathed in, we have taken in oxygen. So the oxygen molecules are moving from region of higher concentration. Where is the concentration low? It is in the tissues, right? So the blood collects the oxygen from the alveoli, takes it to the tissue. Now, in the tissue, what is more? Carbon dioxide is more. So again, diffusion will occur. The blood will carry the carbon dioxide, bring it back to the alveoli, and then it will go out of a body. So that is how by simple diffusion actually the exchange of gases occur. So it is mainly based on the simple diffusion, which is based on the pressure concentration gradient. So here solubility of gases as well as the thickness of the membrane involved in the process of diffusion are also some of the very important factors that can affect the rate of diffusion. So what is the rate of diffusion? How much diffusion will occur? At what rate diffusion occurs? So it mainly depends on the thickness of the membrane. It also depends on the thickness of the membrane involved in the diffusion process. So therefore, diffusion is one of the important processes that actually In order to maintain, actually during the process of diffusion, a concentration gradient is created, and in order to maintain that concentration gradient, the exchange of gases will occur between the alveoli, the body tissue and the alveoli. So that is how does mainly the exchange of gases occur? It is by a simple diffusion method. So next, talking about the pressure. I told you, right, a pressure gradient is created. So here the pressure contributed, how much pressure the gas contributes. When I say how much pressure the gas contributes, it means I am talking about how much pressure oxygen is contributed, how much pressure the carbon dioxide is contributed. So if diffusion has to occur, pressure of the gases that are there inside are very, very important here. So here, pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called as partial pressure, and it is represented as PO2 for oxygen. So PO2 means partial pressure of oxygen, and PCO2 means partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Here there is a table that is given here which clearly indicates the concentration gradient for oxygen from the alveoli to the blood and then to the tissues. That is true, right? We take in oxygen. What happens there? A partial pressure of oxygen is created. A pressure gradient is created. When that pressure gradient is created, what happens? From the alveoli, the blood will carry, the oxygen will be carried by the blood to the tissues. Now we need to understand how much amount of partial pressure is present with respect to the gases there. So what gases? It is nothing but oxygen and carbon dioxide. First, talking about oxygen. So oxygen in atmospheric air, what is the partial pressure of oxygen? It is 159 millimeter hygroscopic pressure. It is 159 mm Hg. Next, alveoli, it is 104 mm Hg. Next, talking about in the blood, so the partial pressure of oxygen in alveoli is 104 mm Hg. Partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is 40 mm Hg. Then talking about here, that is the deoxygenated blood. So deoxygenated blood means oxygen has been removed from that particular blood. So deoxygenated blood is the blood carrying oxygen, it is 95 mm Hg. The blood which has delivered oxygen into the tissue, that will become a deoxygenated blood, right? Because the blood has delivered the oxygen. Now there is no oxygen in the blood. So therefore deoxygenated blood, in that partial pressure of oxygen is 40 mm Hg. Next, in the tissues it is 40 mm Hg because it would have delivered the oxygen there. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue is 40 mm Hg. Now talking about carbon dioxide. So in carbon dioxide, from where is the carbon dioxide coming? It is coming from the tissues, right? So I'll start from here. So in tissues, it is 45 mm Hg carbon dioxide is present. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 mm Hg. In the blood, it is 40 mm Hg in oxygenated blood, and in the deoxygenated blood it is 45 mm Hg. Next, talking about alveoli, it is 40 mm Hg. Again here, atmospheric air, it is 0.3 mm Hg. So these are the different partial pressures, which is nothing but the pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases. So that partial pressure actually creates a concentration gradient which leads to the diffusion process. So since we have understood this, you will understand this even more better when I move on to the next slide. So here talking about exchange of gases. So what did I tell you? Which is the site for the exchange of gases? It is the alveoli, right? Because whatever it is, be it oxygen, it enters into the alveoli. Carbon dioxide, which is brought from the tissues, that also finally ends up in the alveoli, right? So here we have the alveoli. If you can see here, they have just shown one alveoli here, but the lungs is made up of numerous number of alveoli. So if I draw the lungs, as you can see, it is made up of number of branches, tracheal branches, which end up in small bulb-like structures called as alveoli, right? So this one alveoli, they have just shown it here. So don't get confused. This one alveoli, they have shown it here. So here, inspired air. Inspired air, what have we taken? We have taken oxygen, right? What have we taken inside? We have taken oxygen. What is the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli? It is about 104 mm Hg. As you can see here, it is 104 mm Hg is the partial pressure. Okay, this 104 mm Hg partial pressure creates a pressure gradient or a concentration gradient, therefore diffusing the oxygen. Where is the oxygen diffused? The oxygen from the alveoli diffuses into the blood, that is, it moves into the pulmonary vein. As you can see here, it moves into the pulmonary vein. From the pulmonary vein, it travels into the heart. From the heart, it travels into the arteries. Now here oxygenated blood is being carried and it will be delivered to the tissues. See, I hope you understood now. It will be delivered into the tissues. So from the tissues, now in the tissues, what is there? Carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide, now the blood is deoxygenated. Why the blood is deoxygenated? Because it has delivered the oxygen, right? Because it has delivered the oxygen, it is deoxygenated. Now the blood has delivered the oxygen, no oxygen in the blood. Now the blood, what will do is, it will carry the carbon dioxide from the tissue because that carbon dioxide has to be eliminated from the body. So if you can see here, carbon dioxide will be carried, it will move through the systemic veins and then it will enter into the heart, and from the heart it will enter into the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary artery it will enter into the alveoli of the lung, it will enter into the trachea. From the trachea it will enter into our nostrils and then it will go out into the atmospheric air. So this is a simple process how the exchange of gases takes place. So that is why, because alveoli is the collection center here, alveoli is the center for the exchange of gases. That is what we can say. They have given here the partial pressure of oxygen in the deoxygenated blood 40 mm Hg. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide, it is 45 mm Hg in the deoxygenated blood. Partial pressure of oxygen in the oxygenated blood is 95 mm Hg. Carbon dioxide in the oxygenated blood is 40 mm Hg. So this partial pressure is all the one that actually helps in the diffusion of the gases. So this is about exchange of gases. So moving up further, we'll talk about the diffusion membrane. Why should we learn about the diffusion membrane? Because I told you the thickness of the membrane is one of the important factors in the exchange of gases. So we need to know about it. So the diffusion membrane is made up of three main layers. They are made up of thin squamous epithelium, that is alveoli. In the alveoli, it contains thin squamous epithelium. In the alveolar capillaries, it contains endothelium, and in the base and the basement substance, which is made up of a thin membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding the single layer endothelial cells. So if you can see here, they are made up of, I told you, they are made up of three major layers. What are the three major layers? You can see the outer layer, which is squamous epithelium. So squamous epithelium is single layered because it is a simple tissue, right? So here it is made up of squamous epithelium of alveolar wall. So this is the alveoli, one single alveoli. So the alveoli is covered by one layer which is called as the squamous epithelium. And next it contains basement substance, then it contains endothelium, that is inner to the basement substance is present a layer called as the endothelium. So there are three different layers that are present. So one is the basement substance layer, then the other one is the squamous epithelium layer, and the third one is the endothelium layer. So this is about the alveoli of the lung, that is the bulb-like structure that is present at the tip of the trachea, tracheal branches. So that alveoli, actually it is made up of three major layers. So therefore, these three major layers are the ones that forms the diffusion membrane, and it is the thickness of this diffusion membrane actually decides how much the diffusion has to take place, or what is the rate of diffusion has to be. So however, the total thickness of the membrane. So what is total thickness? It should include the squamous epithelium, it should include the basement substance, and it should include the endothelium. So these three layers put together, the total thickness is much less than a millimeter. We might think, oh, there are three layers, it might be thick, but no. When all the three layers are put together, in spite of that, the membrane is very, very thin, wherein the thickness is just less than a millimeters. So therefore, all the factors in our body are favorable for diffusion of oxygen. So that is the reason, because the diffusion membrane is very, very thin. So that is why oxygen can diffuse very, very easily. So that is the reason. Diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli to the tissues, and that of carbon dioxide from the tissues to the alveoli. So from the tissues, if the carbon dioxide has to move into the alveoli, and from the alveoli, if the oxygen has to move into the tissues, for both of these also, they have to pass through a thin membrane. That is the diffusion membrane. Though it is very, very thick, though it is made up of 3 layers, it is thin. So that is why diffusion takes place very, very easily. And therefore, the exchange of gases takes place very, very easily. So that is why the thickness of the diffusion actually decides the rate of diffusion. How much carbon dioxide has to travel, all that will be decided by the thickness of the membrane. So next, talking about the transport of gases. So transport of gases, how gases get transported. I told you blood is the medium. None of the gases, be it oxygen or carbon dioxide, can as such move inside a body. It has to have a vehicle, it has to have a transporter. Here in this particular case, the transporter is nothing but the blood. So the blood, it receives the oxygen from the alveoli, then it delivers it into the body tissues. Through the heart, it will pass it to the heart, then through the heart, it will deliver it to the body tissue. So blood is the medium for transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and about 97% of oxygen is transported by the red blood cells in the blood. The remaining 3% oxygen is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Plasma is the colorless fluid component that is present in the blood. So plasma carries only 3% of oxygen, whereas 97% of oxygen is carried by the blood, that is transported by the RBC. So therefore, RBCs are very, very important, because the red blood cells are made up of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is nothing but made up of 4 iron components, right? And these ions are the one that actually help in the transport of the oxygen. So that is why RBCs play a major role in the transport of oxygen. How much percentage? 97% is transported by the RBC. And nearly 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is transported by RBC, whereas 70% is carried as bicarbonate. So RBCs also contribute in carrying carbon dioxide. It is not just oxygen, but it carries only 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide, whereas 70% of carbon dioxide is carried in the form of bicarbonate ions. And about 7% of carbon dioxide is carried by the plasma, that is in the form of a dissolved state. It is carried by the plasma, which is the colorless fluid matrix of the blood. So that is how this particular transport of gases occurs. So what did we understand here? Transport of gases, which is the medium for transport of gases? One is blood. In blood, RBC contributes 97% to transport of oxygen, and the carbon dioxide is also transported by RBC, but only 25%. Remaining, whatever 70% is carried in the form of bicarbonate ions, and the remaining 7% carbon dioxide that is there, that is carried by the blood plasma. So this is this is the medium for the transport of gases. So therefore, whatever it may be, blood is the main medium for the transport of gases. So in particular, let's study about the transport of oxygen here first. So hemoglobin, that is present in blood. Where in blood? It is present in RBCs, right? Why are RBCs red in color? Because they have a pigment called as hemoglobin. Heme is nothing but a iron content. They are made up of 4 iron molecules. So hemoglobin is a red colored iron containing pigment that is present in the RBC. So this oxygen that is there, we inhale in oxygen, right? That oxygen will end up in the alveoli of our lungs. From the alveoli, it has to be carried by the blood. So here what happens here is oxygen, it binds with hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. Oxygen combines with hemoglobin, I'll write it as HB, HB is hemoglobin, to form oxyhemoglobin. And each hemoglobin molecule can carry a maximum of 4 molecules. Why 4 molecules of oxygen it can carry? Because hemoglobin is made up of 4 iron molecules, and each iron molecule will carry 1 molecule of oxygen. That is why RBC can carry, or hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. And the binding of oxygen with the hemoglobin is also related to the partial pressure of oxygen. Partial pressure of oxygen we had studied, right? Partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, partial pressure of oxygen in the oxygenated blood, deoxygenated blood in the tissues, all that we learned. So, what is the partial pressure of oxygen? Based on that, the binding capacity of oxygen to the hemoglobin will occur. And partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration, then temperature are also other factors which contribute to, or which can take part in the binding of the oxygen to the hemoglobin. So, if oxygen has to bind with hemoglobin, not just the partial pressure of oxygen plays a very important role here, but apart from that, the temperature, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the hydrogen ion concentration, all this also, based on all this also, how much oxygen molecules can bind with the hemoglobin, that will be decided. So, this is about transport of oxygen. And by plotting a curve, we can understand exactly how it takes place. So, sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against partial oxygen. So, how exactly partial oxygen contributes to the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin, that can be studied by using a sigmoid curve. So, sigmoid curve is nothing but a S-shaped curve. So, this curve is called the oxygen dissociation curve, and it is very useful in studying the effect of various factors like partial carbon dioxide, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the hydrogen ion concentration, etc. Because I told you, it is not just that is partial pressure of oxygen that contributes to the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. I had told you in the previous slide that apart from that, the number of hydrogen ions, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, all that also contributes to how much oxygen goes and binds to the hemoglobin. So, by plotting the partial pressure of oxygen against the oxygen, by plotting a graph of oxygen, that is the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen with that of partial pressure of oxygen, we'll get a sigmoid curve. What does this sigmoid curve depicts? This sigmoid curve actually helps us to understand the effects of various factors like partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the hydrogen ion concentration, how do they contribute, also contribute to the binding of the oxygen to the hemoglobin, that we will understand by this particular graph here. So, here they have shown, as you can see, the partial pressure of oxygen rises with the increase in the, as the partial pressure of oxygen rises, as you can see here, as the partial pressure of oxygen increases up to a certain state, you can see that the percentage saturation of oxygen with the hemoglobin also increases. After that, it will start to become stagnant. Once it reaches 100% saturation, and once the partial pressure is 100%, the binding of the oxygen molecule with the hemoglobin will reach a saturation point. That is, it will become stagnant. So, that is what we can understand. So, that is what we can understand with this particular oxygen dissociation curve. So, here talking about the alveoli again. So, in the alveoli where there is high partial pressure of oxygen, right? In the alveoli, partial pressure of oxygen is very high. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very low, and and the concentration of hydrogen ions is also less, and the temperature is also low. All these factors, be it the partial pressure of oxygen, be it the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, be it the temperature, be it the hydrogen ion, all these factors are favorable for the formation of oxyhemoglobin. How will oxyhemoglobin be formed? When oxygen binds with hemoglobin, it forms oxyhemoglobin. How much oxyhemoglobin gets formed depends on the concentration, depends on that is the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the hydrogen ion concentration and the temperature. So, whereas in the tissues, low, I can make you understand this in an easy way. So, if the correct binding of oxygen with the hemoglobin should occur, wherein oxyhemoglobin will be formed, if that has to occur in the alveoli, what should be the exact state of all these? Exact state of what? Exact state of partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration, temperature. How much it should be, we shall see. So, in the alveoli, if oxyhemoglobin has to be formed, then the partial pressure of oxygen should be very, very high. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide will be low. The hydrogen ion concentration will be less and the temperature will also be low. Now talking about in the tissues. In tissues, how the state is, we shall see. In tissues, the concentration of oxygen will be low. That is true, right? Because if in the tissues concentration, partial pressure of oxygen is low, then the pressure gradient will be created. Therefore, from a higher partial pressure, that is from the alveoli, the oxygen will diffuse into the tissue. So, that is why. So, in the tissues, partial pressure of oxygen is low, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, the hydrogen ion concentration is also high and the temperature also is high. So, these conditions are favorable for dissociation of oxygen from the oxyhemoglobin. Now, to make you understand, I can say, okay, so this is the alveoli, this is the tissues. So, here in the alveoli, what is the partial pressure of oxygen? It is high. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low. So, this is alveoli. Hydrogen ions is low. Temperature is low. In the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is low. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high. The hydrogen ion concentration high. Temperature high. So, therefore, what happens? A pressure gradient is created. So, when a pressure gradient created, what happens? The oxygen from the alveoli will diffuse into the tissues. The carbon dioxide from the tissues will diffuse into the alveoli. So, that is what occurs here. So, this is how, what will happen? Yeah, that is one thing that happens. Apart from that, here in the alveoli, oxyhemoglobin will be formed under this condition. Wherein partial pressure of oxygen will be more, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is less, hydrogen ion concentration is less, temperature is less. Here what happens? Oxyhemoglobin is formed. Can this oxyhemoglobin go here, diffuse here and remain in the tissues as such? No. From the hemoglobin, oxygen has to get separated. Why? Because every oxygen molecule should get deposited in the tissue, right? Then only from the tissues, carbon dioxide can be taken and delivered back to the alveoli. So, for that particular reason. So, this is how. So, therefore, if this process, if the diffusion of oxygen from the hemoglobin has to occur in the tissues, then partial pressure of oxygen should be less, partial pressure of carbon dioxide will be more, hydrogen ion is more, temperature is also should be more. So, this is how the transport of oxygen will occur. So, all this put together, this is how the exchange of gases actually occurs. So, this is about the transport of oxygen. So, now whatever I said about the partial pressure of oxygen, carbon dioxide, then the hydrogen ion concentration, the temperature. So, all this clearly indicates that oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin in the lung surface and it gets dissociated into the tissues. That is true, right? It gets in the alveoli, all this will take place. Then the oxyhemoglobin will enter into the tissues. In the tissues, the oxygen and hemoglobin will get separated. Oxygen will be delivered and the hemoglobin will carry the carbon dioxide back to the alveoli. So, that is why all this process clearly indicates that oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin in the lung surface and then gets dissociated into the tissues. So, every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver about 5 ml of oxygen to the tissues under normal physiological conditions. What normal physiological conditions? Those which I had discussed earlier, how much the partial pressure of oxygen should be, how much the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is, hydrogen ion concentration, temperature. If all these are favorable, then every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver to the tissues that 5 ml of oxygen every time the breathing occurs. So this is about transport of oxygen. So next, talking about the transport of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, from where it will be carried? It will be carried from the tissues into the alveoli, right? So carbon dioxide, again this is also carried by the hemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin has dissociated oxygen into the tissues. Now in the hemoglobin, oxygen is not there, it is empty. Now the carbon dioxide can be carried by the blood or the hemoglobin. So carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. So if carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin, it is called as carbaminohemoglobin. And how much percentage of carbon dioxide the hemoglobin can carry? It is only 20 to 25%. So this binding, how much amount of carbon dioxide can bind to the hemoglobin, that also depends on the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So here, and also partial pressure of oxygen is also a major factor which can affect this binding. Here temperature, hydrogen ions, all these do not contribute here. Here what contributes? How much amount of the carbon dioxide can bind to the hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin, that will be decided by the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide and the partial pressure of oxygen. So here what happens? So when partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high and partial pressure of oxygen is low in the tissues. Now talking again, I'll write here alveoli. I'll write here tissues. Now partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high in the tissues. Partial pressure of oxygen is low in the tissues. Now, from here, the carbon dioxide has to diffuse to the alveoli. So, whereas when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low here and partial pressure of oxygen is high, oxygen will diffuse here. So this is how this pressure gradient actually plays a major role. This is how it plays a major role. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high and partial pressure of oxygen is low in the tissues. More binding of carbon dioxide will occur to where? Hemoglobin. What happens here? Carbon dioxide will bind with hemoglobin to form carbaminoglobin. Now this carbaminohemoglobin, or we can call it as carbaminohemoglobin. Now the carbaminohemoglobin will move to the alveoli and it will diffuse the carbon dioxide in the alveoli. Now carbon dioxide will be diffused. What will be left? Hemoglobin will be left. That hemoglobin, again it will carry the oxygen. It will bind with the oxygen, it will form the oxyhemoglobin and it will come back to the tissues. So this is how the cycle continues here. This is how, based on the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and oxygen, the diffusion of the carbon dioxide from the tissues into the alveoli will take place. So this is about the transport of carbon dioxide. So next, talking about the RBC. So here I told you the RBCs, that is the hemoglobin that is present in the RBC, actually helps in carrying the carbon dioxide as well, wherein the carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. So RBC contains a high concentration of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and it also contains very minute quantities of the same enzyme in the plasma. So plasma also contributes, we had learnt about it, right? Plasma also contributes in carrying the carbon dioxide, but the amount is negligible. So therefore here there is one enzyme, so carbonic anhydrase. So carbonic anhydrase concentration is more in RBCs. That is why RBCs contribute major in transporting the carbon dioxide, whereas in plasma it is very less. So that is, carbonic anhydrase concentration is very less. So that is why the plasma contributes less to the transport of the oxygen. So this enzyme, that is carbonic anhydrase, is a very important enzyme Along with partial pressure of carbon dioxide and partial pressure of oxygen, the presence of carbonic anhydrase in the blood is also very, very important, because this is the enzyme that actually helps in the diffusion of the carbon dioxide. So, here carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase form carbonic acid, and in the present again here they get diffused like this. So, this is how the diffusion occurs. So, therefore, if this particular diffusion has to occur, then carbonic anhydrase is very, very important. And at the tissue site where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high due to catabolism, carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood. So, what happens here at the tissue? So, from where that is hemoglobin, that is the RBC, collects the carbon dioxide, it is in the tissues, right? In the tissues, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high. Therefore, at the tissues where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, due to the catabolism process, carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood and it forms the carbonic ion, that is, it will form carbaminohemoglobin, right? And at the alveolar site where partial carbon dioxide is low, the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction, leading to the formation of the carbon dioxide and water. So, here I will write it again, alveoli and the tissue. Here the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low. Here partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high. So, in the presence of carbonic anhydrase enzyme, what happens? The carbon dioxide will diffuse into the RBC. The RBC, in the presence of the carbonic anhydrase, they will form the carbaminohemoglobin, right? Carbaminohemoglobin. Then they will carry the carbon dioxide, they will diffuse it here. How are they able to diffuse it here? Because here the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very, very less. So, therefore, here what will happen? They will diffuse. When they diffuse, what happens? Carbon dioxide will get separated from water, and this carbon dioxide will move out into the air from the alveoli, that is through a nostril. So, that is how this particular exchange of carbon dioxide occurs. So, therefore, from this whole thing we understood that partial pressure of the gases is very, very important in the diffusion process or in the transport or exchange of gases. So, it is very, very important. So, thus carbon dioxide that is trapped as bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli is released out as carbon dioxide. That is what I said earlier. So, every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of carbon dioxide to the alveoli. So, the deoxygenated blood is capable of delivering, that is 100 ml of deoxygenated blood is capable of, why it is called a deoxygenated blood? Because it is not containing the oxygen, it has deposited the oxygen in the tissues and it is empty to carry the carbon dioxide from the tissues to the lungs. So, that deoxygenated blood, every 100 ml of that deoxygenated blood is capable of delivering approximately 4 ml of carbon dioxide to the alveoli. So, this is about the transport of gases. Now, we shall see how the respiration gets regulated. So, human beings have a very significant ability to maintain and to moderate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demands of the body tissues. Sometimes our breathing are very fast, right? Sometimes our breathing is very slow. When we are doing an exercise, we can feel the breathing process rapidly increasing. So, that is how our body, depending on the amount of oxygen we want, that is how our body responds or adjusts itself for the breathing process. So, this is done by the neural system. So, how much? The nerve cells will send signals to the brain saying that this person is exercising, he needs to take in more of oxygen. So, let the breathing rate increase, or the availability of oxygen to this person that he is getting is very, very less. So, he needs more amount of oxygen, let his breathing rate increase. So, that is how all the neural signals that are there, they send information to the lungs as well as the heart, stating that the regulation of breathing has to occur. So, specialized center present in the medulla region of the brain, which is called as the respiratory rhythm center, is the one that is actually responsible for the regulation. So, they belong to the central nervous system, right? The brain, the spinal cord and all that. In our brain, there is a region called as the medulla. That medulla region of the brain is the one which is called as the respiratory rhythm center, because that medulla region is the one that actually receives and sends the signals stating how the rhythm of the respiration or rhythm of breathing has to be, depending on the activity of the person or depending on the availability of oxygen to that particular person. There is one more center in the brain which is called as the pons region. So this pons region, so one was medulla. Medulla is called as the rhythm center, respiratory rhythm center. Why? It actually sends signal how the rhythm of the respiration has to be. And pons, one more region in the brain which is called as the pons region. It is called as the pneumotaxic center. Why? Because it can moderate the function of the respiratory rhythm center. So the function of the medulla, that is the respiratory rhythm center, is actually controlled by the pons, and therefore it is called as the pneumotaxic center. And neural signal from this center, from the pons as well as from the medulla, from the center, can reduce the duration of inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. How much we should inspire, how much air we should take in, all that it is easy to understand. So which is the organ in our body that actually controls our breathing? It is the brain. Which part of the brain? The medulla part. The medulla part is coordinated or controlled by the pons region of the brain. So therefore it is this part of the brain, that is the medulla part of the brain, which actually decides the duration of inspiration, how much amount we have to take in. So therefore that is what controls it. So about inspiration, what about the other? There is a chemosensitive area which is situated adjacent to the rhythm center. So which is the rhythm center? The medulla. Somewhere near the medulla, there is present a region which is called as the chemosensitive area. So this chemosensitive area is highly sensitive to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. So increase in the amount of carbon dioxide. So in the tissues, as carbon dioxide increases, signals will be sent to our brain stating that, okay, the carbon dioxide has to be removed from the tissues. It has to move into the alveoli and it has to be expired out. So, for inspiration, which is the region that helps? The pons and the medulla region of the brain. The medulla, which is called as the rhythm center of the brain. For expiration, what actually helps? It is the chemosensitive area that is present near the medulla region actually helps in the expiration process. So, increase in these substances will activate the chemosensitive area, which in turn can signal the rhythm center to make necessary adjustment in the respiratory process, by which these substances can be eliminated. So it is easy understood. If we need to take in oxygen, how much amount of oxygen has to be taken in? How much inspiration has to occur? That is controlled by the pons and the rhythm center, that is the medulla region. And how much amount of carbon dioxide has to be given out? That is controlled by the chemosensitive area and the rhythm center, that is the medulla region. And there are some receptors that are associated with the aortic arc and the carotid artery. So these aortic arc and carotid arteries also participate in the transport of the gases. So they can also recognize changes in the carbon dioxide and hydrogen concentration, and they also send signals to the rhythm center for the, that is, rhythm center means it is nothing but the medulla. They also send signals to the medulla region of the brain so that immediate remedial actions can be taken to remove the excess of carbon dioxide and very soon take in oxygen. So the role of oxygen in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is very, very important. So the amount of oxygen that we take in is very, very important. So we take in oxygen. How much amount of oxygen we need to inspire? That will be decided by the pons, which will send signal to the medulla. That medulla will send signals to our respiratory system. Therefore, it will help in inspiration. After that, the oxygen will be carried by the blood, delivered into the body tissues. And as in the body tissues, the carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration increases, the chemosensitive area that is present near the medulla, it will receive the signals, it will transport the signals to the rhythm center, that is nothing but the medulla. Then the medulla will transport the signal to the respiratory system, stating that the carbon dioxide has to be thrown out of the body by expiration. So these are the regulations of respiratory, or the sites for the regulation of respiratory system. So where are these sites actually located? They are located in the brain, that is the medulla, pons, and the chemosensitive area of a brain. So this was about regulation, how the regulation of respiration occurs, what actually controls the process of respiration. So next, talking about the disorders of the respiratory system. So one of the major disorder of respiratory system is asthma. So a person having asthma, he will have difficulty in breathing. So difficulty in breathing is he will not have the ability to take in enough of oxygen. So difficulty in breathing, which later on causes wheezing due to inflammation of the bronchi and the bronchioles. So bronchi, that is the main branch, and the secondary branches, that is the bronchioles that are there, these will inflame, they will swell up, and their inflammation will actually lead to wheezing. So asthma in turn leads to wheezing. So therefore asthma is one of the important respiratory disorders. Next important respiratory disorder is called as emphysema. So emphysema is a chronic disorder in which the alveolar walls are damaged. So alveolar walls, the epithelium, the endothelium of alveolar region, they get damaged. So when these alveolar walls get damaged, because we all know that the alveolar walls are the ones that actually decide the diffusion of the gases, right? They themselves get damaged, how will the diffusion of gases take place properly? So that is when the respiratory problems will start, and one of the major causes for emphysema is cigarette smoking. So cigarette smoking actually, it damages the membrane of the alveoli. If the membrane of the alveoli gets damaged, then the diffusion process of the gases will get affected. If the diffusion process of gases get affected, then what happens? Proper deposition of the oxygen to the tissues and the removal of carbon dioxide from the tissues will not take place, therefore leading to difficulty in breathing. So therefore it is better to quit smoking of the cigarettes or to avoid them. So next important respiratory disorder is the occupational respiratory disorder. So in certain occupational means, be it you're working in an industry or you're working in a mining center, you're working in a stone crushing center. So all there in such places actually this particular occupational respiratory disorders can be found. So in certain industries, especially those involved in grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully function in order to remove that entire dust from the body. So that is the time when long exposure to such dust can lead to the inflammation of the lungs. So inflammation of the lungs is nothing but fibrosis. Fibrosis or scarring of the lung tissue can occur. So if the scarring occurs, then the diffusion membrane can get affected. So therefore, thus causing a serious lung damage. People working in such industries should always wear protective masks so that they are not subjected to too much of dust. Therefore, that particular dust will not cause fibrosis or scarring of the lung tissues. Therefore, their lungs can be protected and the breathing can take place properly. So this is one of the important occupational respiratory disorders. So these are some of the important respiratory disorders. So I hope you understood this chapter well. With this particular session, this chapter comes to an end. So we shall meet again in the coming sessions with a new chapter. Thank you.